There is a version of the forest that exists in daylight. Mapped trails, marked distances, rangers on call. You can see the canopy from a distance. You can estimate how far the light reaches. The wilderness feels managed in those hours, understandable, even friendly. But those who spend enough time in the deep parts of state parks, in the places where the maintained trail ends and the trees grow too close together to walk straight, will tell you something that doesn't show up in any brochure. They'll tell you quietly, carefully, in the way people talk about things they haven't entirely processed. They'll say that something out there doesn't belong, and they can't tell you what it was. The accounts in this collection come from people who went in for ordinary reasons: a hike, a camping trip, a job, a walk at the wrong hour. None of them expected to come back with something unresolved still sitting behind their eyes. But here they are. Settle in. From here on, the story doesn't need to be seen, only heard. If you want to close your eyes, that's fine. If you want to leave the screen dark, that's fine too. What you imagine will be more accurate than anything I could show you. Before we begin, drop a comment and tell me where in the world you're listening from and what time it is there right now. There's something about knowing you're not the only one sitting with this that makes it a little easier. Story 1. The Night Survey. I've done dozens of wildlife surveys since I started with the state forestry department, and this one isn't the reason I changed careers. But it's the reason I stopped volunteering for the night shifts. It was a bat acoustic survey, the kind where you set up recording equipment along a transect at dusk and then walk the line twice in the dark, collecting data cards and checking that nothing's been knocked loose by deer or weather. The forest was a large state park in the upper Midwest, and I had done this particular transect 3 times before. I knew where the trail bent, where the roots were, where the creek crossing was shallow enough to step across without wet boots. I was on my second pass, heading back toward the trailhead, maybe 40 minutes into the return, when I heard movement off to my left. Not close, maybe 60, 70 feet into the trees. I slowed down and listened. Deer make a specific kind of sound when they move at night. A low, almost rhythmic percussion of hooves on soft ground. Sometimes a branch snap, sometimes nothing at all. This wasn't that. Whatever was moving was taking long, spaced steps, slow, deliberate, weight shifting in a way that felt upright. I stopped walking and turned off my headlamp. I don't know exactly why I did that. Some instinct, the kind of thing you do before you fully understand that you've decided to do it. I stood very still in the dark and listened, and the movement off to my left stopped at approximately the same time. I waited, maybe 30 seconds, maybe a minute. Time does something strange when you're standing in a dark forest waiting for a sound to either continue or resolve. Then I heard breathing. Not labored breathing, not an animal panting. A slow, measured exhale, the kind that takes maybe 4 or 5 seconds to complete. The kind of breath a person takes when they are trying to be very quiet but have been exerting themselves. I turned my headlamp back on and called out. I said hello. I said I was with forestry and asked if someone needed help. My voice came out steadier than I expected. I said it again. Nothing moved. Nothing answered. I stood there for another minute, a light aimed at the tree line, and then I started walking again. Not running. I want to be clear about that. I walked, and I kept my pace even, because running felt like an answer to a question I didn't want to ask. I got back to my truck, loaded the equipment, and sat in the cab for probably 10 minutes before I started the engine. I filed a standard incident note with the park. Mentioned a possible person off trail, noted location and approximate time. The park contacted the county sheriff's office. No one had been reported missing. No hikers had signed out late. The area I'd flagged was a half-mile from the nearest fire road. I never heard an explanation. I still don't have one. What I have is the memory of that exhale in the dark, and the certainty that whatever was standing in those trees had heard me coming long before I heard it. The next account comes from someone who was never the type to talk about things like this. Story 2. The Ridgeline. My uncle spent 20 years working trail maintenance for a national forest in the southern Appalachians. He's a practical man, doesn't embellish, doesn't dramatize. The kind of person who, if something was going to bother him, would tell you plainly what it was and why it bothered him, and leave it at that. He told me this story once, maybe 15 years ago, sitting at the kitchen table after dinner. He told it the same way he'd tell you about a busted truck axle or a bad stretch of weather. He was working a section of high ridge trail, elevation around 4,000 feet, remote enough that you don't see recreational hikers up there except in the height of summer. It was early October. He was alone, which was normal for that kind of maintenance work. Just walking the trail, logging erosion points, flagging sections that needed regrading. Around 2 in the afternoon, he crested a small rise and saw someone standing on the trail about 150 yards ahead. He said his first thought was annoyance. That time of year, there weren't supposed to be any permitted campers in that zone, and he assumed he was going to have an awkward conversation about regulations. He kept walking toward the figure. At about 100 yards, he noticed that the person hadn't moved at all. Not a shift of weight, not a turn of the head. Just standing there, facing away from him, staring into the tree line on the left side of the trail. At about 70 yards, he stopped. He said the proportions were wrong. He couldn't say exactly what he meant by that, even when I pressed him. He said the figure was the right general shape for a person. 2 legs, 2 arms, upright posture. But something about the length of things, the way it stood, didn't sit correctly in his eye. He thought about optical illusions. He thought about the light. He told himself the distance was distorting his perception. He called out, said hello, told the person they were on a maintenance-restricted trail, and asked if they needed assistance. His voice echoed off the ridge wall on the right side and came back at him. The figure turned its head, not its body, just the head, slowly over its left shoulder. He couldn't make out a face at that distance, just the silhouette of a turned head. Then it stepped off the trail into the trees. No hurry, no stumbling, just a single deliberate step sideways, and it was gone. He stood there for a while. He didn't follow it. He finished logging his erosion markers and went back to his truck the same way he'd come. He said that when he passed the spot where it had been standing, there were no boot prints in the soft trail mud, no marks of any kind. He only told me the story once. When I tried to bring it up years later, he said he didn't remember it clearly and changed the subject. I don't think that was true. I think he just decided there was nothing useful left to say about it. This one happened several years ago in a park that most people in that state have driven past without stopping. Story 3. The Deer Blind. I want to be careful about how I say this because I know how it sounds. I've hunted since I was 12 years old. I've spent more hours sitting alone in the dark in the woods than I could count. I am not a person who gets rattled by sounds or movement. I am not someone who confuses a bear with a ghost story. This was 3 seasons ago. I was in a permanent blind on the edge of a state forest property. up in a ladder stand about 14 feet off the ground, well before first light. This was a stand I had used for years. I knew every sound that place made. The creek 60 yards east, the woodpecker hollow in the big dead oak, the way the wind came down from the northwest and hit the ridge and spilled into the basin below me. About 40 minutes before the legal shooting light, something walked into the clearing below the stand. I heard it before I saw it. Footsteps, not hooves. Feet with weight behind them, pressing through the wet leaves at a Saramas unhurried pace. I had my flashlight off. I was watching the clearing with my eyes adjusted to the dark, and I could make out shapes reasonably well. What walked into the clearing was tall. I've seen tall people before. I know what 6'2", 6'3" looks like at a distance. This was taller than that, or it seemed to be. It moved in a way that was almost languid. Long stride, no urgency. And it crossed into the clearing from the west tree line and stopped maybe 30 feet from the base of my stand. It stood there, just stood, not looking up at me from what I could tell, facing generally east, toward where the light would eventually come. I held still and said nothing. I don't know if it knew I was there. I don't know what it was doing. After what felt like several minutes but was probably less, it turned and walked back into the trees to the west. Same pace as before, no rush, no reaction to anything I did or didn't do. When the light came up, I climbed down from the stand and walked to the clearing. The leaves were pressed in a couple of places near the tree line. You could argue they were tracks, or you could argue they were nothing. There was nothing else. I sat in that stand for 2 more hours and then packed out. I didn't see any deer that morning. I didn't see anything else. I haven't been back to that stand since. Not because I made a decision about it. I just keep finding reasons to hunt other spots. Another experience that still bothers me. This one sent in by a reader who asked to remain unnamed. Story 4. The Wrong Trail. Some things you can't stop thinking about, not because they were terrifying in the moment, but because the explanation you eventually settle on is somehow worse than not having one at all. 2 summers ago, my girlfriend and I were day hiking in a state park that neither of us had visited before. It was a popular enough park. We had passed other hikers earlier in the afternoon, but by 4 o'clock, we had gotten off the main loop and onto a connector trail that the map showed as a direct route back to the parking area. The connector was rougher than we expected. The undergrowth had come in over the path in places, and the blazes on the trees were old and faded. We were still moving in the right direction, according to our compass bearing, and we weren't worried. It was going to be fine. We had about 2 hours of usable light. We had been on the connector for maybe 20 minutes when we noticed a figure standing in the trees about 40 feet off the path on the right side. Just standing, not moving, not walking toward us, not calling out. A person, by all appearances, standing in the woods and watching us pass. My girlfriend saw it first and grabbed my arm. I stopped and looked. It was in shadow. The sun had dropped enough that the tree cover on that side was very dark, but the outline was clearly human. Standing height, 2 arms at the sides, facing us. I called out hello. I asked if they were okay. No response. We started walking again, a little faster. I kept looking back over my shoulder. The figure didn't follow us. It didn't move at all that we could see. It just stood there as we moved away from it. About 10 minutes later, we came around a curve in the trail, and there was a figure on the path ahead of us. Same height, same posture. Standing in the center of the trail, maybe 60 feet ahead, facing us. My girlfriend made a sound beside me that I won't try to describe. I felt something go cold in my chest. We stopped. I told myself it was a different person. 2 different hikers, both off trail. a coincidence of similar shapes in similar light. I said out loud that we were heading to the parking lot and asked if this was the right trail. My voice was level. I'm proud of that. No response, no movement. We turned around and went back the way we'd come. We hit the main loop and were back at the car before dark. We didn't speak much during the drive home. A week later, I contacted the park office to ask if they had any reports of people in distress on the connector trail around that date and time. They said they didn't. They mentioned that the connector had been flagged for poor maintenance and that hikers sometimes got disoriented on it. They didn't mention anyone standing in the trees. I didn't ask. The next story comes from a man who worked alone in the woods for many years. He says he only had one experience he couldn't explain. Story 5. The timber plot. I've been a forestry consultant for over 30 years. I've walked more timber plots than I could tell you. Wetlands, old growth fragments, plantation rows, burned sections recovering slowly over decades. I'm comfortable in the woods in a way that most people aren't, and I mean that without arrogance. It's just familiarity. You stop being afraid of forests the way you stop being afraid of a kitchen. You learn the sounds, the light, the logic of the place. This was in the early 2000s. I was doing a preliminary cruise of a timber plot in a large state forest. Just walking a sample grid, taking measurements, getting a sense of the stand composition for a report I'd been contracted to write. The landholding was several thousand acres. I was the only person working that section. I was 3 or 4 hours into the survey when I became aware that I had seen the same shape in my peripheral vision twice in the last 10 minutes. Off to the right, at about the edge of my useful sight. Just a standing shape, dark, vertical, there and then gone when I turned to look directly at it. The first time, I assumed it was a snag, a dead standing tree. The second time, I stopped and turned to look straight at the spot, and there was nothing there. Not a snag, not a tree in a configuration that would have suggested a vertical shape. A gap in the understory, actually. A place where you could see fairly far back into the forest. I stood there looking for maybe a minute. Nothing. I made a note in my field book that I'd seen something. Professional habit. And kept going. 20 minutes later, I heard it. Footsteps in the leaf litter, paralleling my course about 30 or 40 feet to my right, matching my pace. When I sped up, they sped up. When I slowed, they slowed. When I stopped completely, there was a brief delay. 2, maybe 3 steps after mine, and then silence. I called out, standard forestry announcement. Identified myself, asked if someone was in the area, mentioned that I was working an active survey, and there were no trespassing notices at the access road, nothing. The paralleling sound didn't resume when I started walking again. I don't know if it stopped or if I simply stopped noticing it. I completed the survey. The report was filed on time. I never mentioned the footsteps in the field notes, partly because I had no way to verify them, and partly because I'd spent 30 years not putting things I couldn't verify into field notes. You learn what belongs and what doesn't. What I can tell you is that I was not nervous in those woods in general, and I was nervous that afternoon in a way that didn't leave until I got back to my truck and locked the door. That, to me, is the only data point that still matters. This experience belongs to a woman who has asked that her location remain vague. She says she's told it only twice before. Story 6. The campsite at mile 14. My first solo backpacking trip was supposed to be 3 days. I cut it to 2. I was 26, reasonably experienced, and the route was a well-documented trail through a state park that saw moderate traffic in late summer. I'd read the trip reports. I had my gear dialed in. I was not someone who panicked easily, and I was not someone who spooked at sounds in the night. I'd been camping since childhood. The campsite at mile 14 was the planned stop for my first night. I got there around 6 in the evening, set up my tent, filtered water from the creek, and made dinner. Everything is normal. The site was a solo site. No other tents, no other hikers visible in either direction of the trail. I got into my sleeping bag around 9, read for a while, turned off my headlamp around 10. Sometime in the night. I can't tell you exactly when because I wasn't looking at the time, but the quality of the dark suggested it was somewhere between midnight and 3. I woke up and lay still listening. The way you do when something has pulled you out of sleep, but you're not sure what it was. Outside the tent, very close, maybe 10 or 12 feet, I heard breathing. Slow, deliberate breathing. Not an animal. Animals have a specific cadence, a specific depth. This was controlled, like someone in a light meditative state, someone who was very calm and very awake. I did not move for a long time. I just listened. The breathing continued for what felt like several minutes. Steady, patient, unchanged in pace. It did not circle the tent. It did not come closer. It just stayed there. Then it stopped. No gradual fade. No footsteps moving away. One breath, and then nothing. I lay awake until gray light came through the tent fabric, and then I broke camp and walked out. I did not stop for breakfast. I did not stop for water. I moved at a pace I am not sure I could maintain again. I've gone back to that park since. Different trails, never that campsite. I've looked it up online. Nothing unusual in the trip reports. No incidents logged. Just a nice, flat campsite near a creek at mile 14. I don't know what I heard. I've offered myself every explanation I can construct, and some of them are even plausible. But I still won't camp alone at a site I can't see out of in all directions before dark. The following story involves a park ranger who spent 11 years working in the same district. Story 7. The one thing he couldn't log. He told me he'd seen bears, mountain lions, elk, and once a bobcat with an injury that had altered its gait enough to be briefly unrecognizable. He'd worked rescues, he'd found bodies, he'd driven trails in zero visibility fog. He said the woods didn't carry mystique for him anymore. They were a workplace, and that was fine. But there was one thing he'd never put in a log. It was a Tuesday in early November. The park was nearly empty for the week. Just 2 groups of hunters with permits in the southern section, both of whom he'd already checked in at the entrance station. He was doing a routine drive of the Northern Fire Road Loop, which was technically closed to public vehicles after October 15th. About halfway around the loop, he stopped the truck to glass a hillside with his binoculars. Just a habit, a way of staying sharp in the quiet weeks. He was looking north toward a burn section that was 8 or 9 years into recovery, mostly young aspens and scrub oak filling back in. In the tree line at the edge of the burn, there was a figure. He said his first instinct was that it was a hunter who had drifted out of the permitted zone. Not unheard of. Something he dealt with a few times a season. He picked it up in the binoculars. Upright, tall, standing at the edge of where the young aspens gave way to a remaining strip of old timber. Just standing. What made him lower the binoculars was the height. He had a pine tree on the hillside that he used informally as a scale reference. He'd measured it a few years back during a timber assessment, so he knew it was a little over 20 feet. The figure was standing beside it, and its head came up to the first branching. which was around 10 or 11 feet off the ground. He told me he sat in that truck for a long time. He raised the binoculars again. The figure had not moved. He put the truck in drive and went the long way around the loop rather than up the hill. When he came back past the burn on the return, the tree line was empty. He told me he didn't log it because he didn't know what to put. Unknown figure observed near northern burn. Estimated height inconsistent with any animal or human in the database. That's not a log entry. That's a career question. He retired from the Park Service 2 years after that. He says it wasn't because of this. I believe him, mostly. This one happened in the Pacific Northwest. The person who sent it asked only that we not mention the specific park name. Story 8. What the dog wouldn't pass. My dog has hiked with me for 7 years. She's a Malinois, incredibly well trained, not prone to reactivity. The kind of dog that watches everything but reacts to nothing unless I ask her to. 7 years of hiking forest trails, many of them off-leash, and she has never refused to walk somewhere I told her to go, until last October. We were on a trail in a large state forest on the Olympic Peninsula. We'd hiked there twice before. She knew the trail, she was relaxed. Nothing was unusual about the morning. It was overcast, which is normal for that area, and quiet, which is also normal in October when the summer crowds are gone. We were maybe 4 miles in when the trail dipped into a low hollow between 2 ridges. The hollow was mossy and very dark, even in midday light. The kind of place that seems to hold cold and moisture even when everything around it has dried out. I'd walked through it before without noticing anything particular about it. This time, my dog stopped at the edge of the hollow and refused to move forward. I stopped beside her. She wasn't growling. She wasn't flagged up into a threat posture. Her ears were forward and her tail was slightly down, and she was just looking into the hollow with the kind of fixed attention that, in her, means she is processing something I cannot see. I looked into the hollow. Trees, moss. The trail continues into shadow. Nothing I could see. I gave her the forward command. She took 1 step and stopped again. I've given that dog commands in situations that would have most trained dogs conflicted, and she has never, before or since, stopped and looked at me the way she looked at me right then. It was not defiance. It was something closer to a question. I stood at the edge of the hollow and stared into it for a long time. The air coming out of it was cold. I don't know if that was unusual or just the physics of the hollow. I could see maybe 60 feet before the trail bent and the shadow closed. Nothing visible, no sound. We turned around and went back the way we'd come. I told myself she'd wind-scented a cougar, which happens. I told myself the hollow had some acoustic quality that was producing a sound below my range of hearing. I told myself everything I could think of. But she looked at me before we turned back. And I know this dog, and whatever she was asking me was not a question I could answer. Another experience. This one from a college student on what was supposed to be a straightforward overnight trip. Story 9. The figure on the opposite shore. There's a lake I've been going to since I was a kid. A backcountry lake that requires about 6 miles of hiking to reach, which means it gets fewer visitors than the road-accessible sites. My family went every summer for years. I know that lake the way you know a place you've visited so many times it becomes part of your internal geography. I went alone for the first time when I was 20, junior year of college. I just wanted solitude and simplicity. I'd done solo backpacking before. This was familiar terrain. I was confident. I got to the lake in the early afternoon, set up camp on the North Shore, and spent the rest of the day reading and fishing. Everything exactly as I'd imagined it. That evening, around 8 o'clock, I was sitting at the edge of the water, watching the last light go off the surface, when I noticed something on the opposite shore. The lake is maybe 300 yards across at its widest point, narrower on the eastern end. I was on the north shore, and the opposite shore, the south shore, was all steep bank and old-growth timber, no accessible campsite. No reason for anyone to be there, but there was a shape at the water's edge on the south shore, upright, stationary. At that distance, in that light, I couldn't resolve the details, but the shape was reading to me as a person standing at the water, looking out across the lake. Looking, it seemed, at me. I watched it for a long time. It didn't move. I told myself it was a snag, a piece of a fallen tree that the failing light was interpreting into a human outline. I've had my vision do that before. The human brain is very good at constructing people out of ambiguous shapes. That's just biology. I went to bed. I convinced myself. In the morning, I looked across the lake first thing. Nothing there. Just trees and banks and still water. I felt foolish. The good kind of foolish. The kind that means you were scared about nothing. I was packing up camp around 10 when I noticed the shore on the south side had something caught in the reeds at the waterline. I'm not going to be dramatic about this. I told myself it was debris. I packed my bag, put my boots on, and hiked out. I don't know what was in those reeds. I didn't cross the lake to check. I've been back once since, and I went with a friend, and we camped on the south shore, just to see what it was like over there. It's steep and heavily wooded, and there's no clear place to stand at the water's edge. Not really. The bank comes right down into the water. I've been thinking about that ever since. The final account in tonight's collection comes from a man I'll simply call M. He shared this only with his wife, and now with us. Story 10. The last mile before dark. I used to run trails, years of it. Half marathons on forest single track, long solo runs in the early morning when the light was still low and the trails were empty. I loved the solitude and the rhythm of it. It was the most alone I ever felt, and I mean that in the best possible way. The run I'm describing was a 12-mile loop in a state forest I'd used dozens of times. I know every uphill, every switchback, every section where the roots have heaved the trail surface into something you have to think about. I'd run it in all seasons. I was comfortable there. This was a late October evening. I'd started later than I intended, which isn't unusual when you have a job that doesn't let you go at 5 o'clock. I was moving well, making up time, but by mile 8, I knew the last 3 miles would be in fading light, and by mile 11, it would be dark. I run with a headlamp on my hat for exactly this situation. I clicked it at around mile 9 and kept going. The trail was familiar. It was fine. Around mile 10 and a half, the trail runs through a narrow section between a steep hillside on the left and a drop-off into a ravine on the right. It's maybe 6 feet wide, maybe 200 yards long. I've always moved through it quickly because the footing is tricky and you can't afford a twisted ankle in there. I was 50 yards into that section when I saw something standing at the far end of it. Tall, very tall. My headlamp was hitting it, and it wasn't reflecting the way eyes do. Animals in headlamp light have an eye shine, a green or orange flash that tells you what you're looking at. This had no eye shine, just a dark shape, standing at the end of the narrow passage, blocking most of the trail width. I stopped. My heart was already elevated from running, so it took me a second to register that the additional acceleration was fear. I stood still. I watched it. It did not move. It was just standing there, at the exit of the narrow section, in the dark, very still, very large. I made noise, clapped, yelled. Standard bear deterrent, because that was what I was telling myself this was. A bear, standing upright, bears do that. It stepped to the side, off the trail, into the trees on the left, against the hillside. The movement was slow, not alarmed, not fleeing. It just moved. I ran through the section. I don't remember deciding to. My legs just went. I cleared the narrow passage and came out into a wider section of trail and ran the last mile and a half without slowing down. At the trailhead, I stood by my car breathing hard and looked back at the forest. Just trees and dark, nothing following. A bear standing upright, caught in a headlamp, in a narrow trail corridor. That's what it was. That's the explanation, and I've accepted it, and I've moved on. But bears are wide through the shoulders, even standing. Whatever that was in my headlamp was narrow, long, not the silhouette of something heavy and broad, something elongated, and it stepped aside for me. It stepped aside like it was being courteous. I still run trails, different parks. What stays with you after all of these accounts is not any single image. It's the consistency of the detail that no one planned to share. The patience of whatever was out there. The way it wasn't pursued. The way it simply waited or watched or walked alongside and then was gone without any conclusion. No attack, no warning, no resolution. Just the shape of something large and still in a dark place. And then nothing. And then you, driving home in silence, trying to decide what to say and finding that you don't have the language for it yet. There are forests in this country that most people will never enter. Miles of canopy with no trail beneath them, no cell signal, no record of what lives and moves inside. We've mapped the surface of other planets with more precision than we've documented what walks in those places after dark. These accounts will not be resolved. That's not a flaw in the telling. That's the nature of what was experienced. Some things happen at the edge of what can be named, and they stay there, just out of reach, in the part of your mind that never quite goes quiet. Even on an ordinary night when you are safely inside and the windows are shut and the dark outside is the perfectly ordinary dark of a perfectly ordinary world. Or so we tell ourselves.